So in this video, I'm going to show you my favorite way to seam a garment or sew a knit garment together. So you see here I have a sweater and I already have one of the sleeves attached. And if you look closely at the seam, you can see that there's this really beautiful decorative seam here. It's also along the shoulder. You can see that here. And it's also along the side of the garment as well. So if you just look along here, you can see that decorative seam that I have. And that continues all the way up the side of the garment. And it also joins the underside of the sleeve as well. See that? So this seaming method is called 3-needle bind off. And it's called that because you actually use 3 needles to seam the pieces together. And it produces that really nice, beautiful seam. Now, usually when you are sewing a garment together, you don't want your seams to show, so you'll sew them in a way that they are on the inside of the work so they don't show. But I personally really like the effect that visible seams give. It just gives an added bit of texture and decoration, in my opinion, and it just makes your finished piece look that more unique. So I really like this technique because I like my seams to show. I like to show the construction of the garment, and I just think it's just an interesting feature to have. So with this method, it just produces a really nice, neat, decorative edge that looks as it should, that it's on purpose and not a mistake. It just adds to the character of the garment. So I'm going to show you how I did that. So you can see, as I've shown you, I've already done one side. Now the other side of this sweater I haven't done yet. So to start, we're going to do the shoulders first. So here's my 2 shoulder pieces right here. Now, in order to have this seam show on the outside or on the public side of the work, you need to sew it with the public side showing. So usually in a pattern, when it says to seam a garment together, it might use terms like sew together with right sides together. So what they're telling you to do is they want you to take the public side of your work, the right side, and butt it up together with the right side of the other piece like this, so that the inside of the garment is facing out, so that when you seam from in here and then turn it back to the right side, that seam isn't going to show. But we're going to do the opposite because we want this seam to show because it's decorative. So we're going to sew our pieces together with the wrong sides together or the right sides facing out. So here's the wrong side of the back piece. Here's the wrong side of the front piece. I'm putting those 2 wrong sides together. Okay, so that's what that means if you see that in a pattern. It's very easy to understand if you just think about it. So what we need to do is make sure that we have our 3 needles. And I suggest that you use circular needles. We're not going to be knitting circularly with them. We're going to be using them as if they were straight needles. But you'll see as I go through this, you'll see why it's beneficial to use circular needles instead of straight needles. And make sure your circular needles, of course, are all the same size, the size that your pattern tells you to use. So what we need to do first is pick up stitches. Now I have a bound off edge on my shoulders. What you could do is leave these edges live when you're knitting. Just put them on a stitch holder and then you can just work from those loose stitches. But because I really want the shoulders of my sweater to be really reinforced and strong because it's going to carry the weight, the sweater is going to hang from the shoulder. So I want to make sure that my shoulders seam doesn't lose its strength and make my garment start to sag. So what I did was I bound those edges off so you can see that. And now I'm going to pick up these bound off stitches onto one of my circular needles. And your pattern will tell you how many stitches that you were to bind off, that you would have bound off on this. So you're just going to pick up that same number. So in my case, I'm going to be picking up 30 stitches along the edge. So just grab your yarn that you're going to use. I'm using the same color yarn, but it might be a cool effect to use a contrasting color to really make your garment stand out. But I'm just going to stick with the same color for this one. So I've just inserted my needle into the first stitch here, and I'm going to pick up and knit. So right here again, I'll show you. I'm picking up the stitch. So I've inserted my needle into the 2 legs of that bound off stitch. You could use one, you could just use the front leg if you wanted, or the back, it doesn't matter. But I like to pick up both. So I like to have those 2 legs of the stitch on. So I've picked it up and now I'm just going to knit the stitch. Okay, and I'm just going to continue along. And I'm going and picking up each of those bound off stitches and knitting them. So here again, here's my bound off stitch. I'm inserting my needle into both legs of that stitch. Then I'm knitting it. And it's as simple as that. And when you look at it from the top, it's easy to see what those stitches are because it looks like a V. So you're going to pick up both of those strands that look like a V. Just pick them up and knit them. So I'm going to continue on to the end until my last stitch, the last bound off stitch, and then I will show you what I have in the end. those 30 stitches from the shoulder have been picked up. What we're going to do now is the exact same on the other shoulder. So I'm just going to cut my yarn so that I can use it on the other shoulder, and I'm just going to leave it on this needle. So now we're going to grab our second circular needle, and again make sure it's the same size as the one you just used. And I'm just going to turn this over because remember, we're picking up stitches with the right side facing. I'm going to pick up the 30 bound off stitches that are on this shoulder. I'm almost done with this side of the shoulder, so I'm just going to show you again what it is that I'm doing. So remember these V-shaped stitches that are the bound off edge. Just insert the needle into both legs. That's my preference of that stitch. Pick it up and then knit it. Now I did mention that you could pick up, say, just one of those legs. You might choose to do this front leg, or you might choose to do the back leg. It doesn't matter. The only thing that you have to do is make sure that you're consistent with that. So whichever way you choose to pick up the stitches, make sure you do it all the way across the row like that, because if you don't, you will see the difference that it just won't look right. So whatever you choose to do, stick with it and do that for the whole piece. Here are all the shoulder stitches picked up here. So we're just going to leave that on the second needle. We're going to cut the yarn and leave a long enough tail when you cut the yarn so that you can comfortably weave this in at the end. So now we're on to the fun part, the actual binding off of these stitches together. We're going to seam these two pieces of the shoulder together by binding off all of these stitches that we picked up. And this is where using a circular needle comes in handy. Examples, just imagine that this is a straight needle, and then the other needle, the tip of it, would be facing that way. So now how would you knit with that? Because the idea is we're going to put these two together and then we're going to knit all the stitches together. So we're going to be knitting from this direction, but the needles are facing in opposite directions. So that's what would happen if you have straight needles. You would then have to say, take the stitches off, turn your needle the right way and place those stitches back on. So it's doable, but it's an extra step. So why not just use circular needles? Because it doesn't matter. You can move the end of the needle to where you need it. So hopefully that made sense, because we want both of our tips, or our working end, we want them in the same position on either side. All right, so circular needles just make it a whole lot easier. So both of my needles are facing the way that I want. They're ready. They're ready to start to work. I mean, that's where our third needle comes in. Again, make sure it's the same size as the other two that you were using. And just place both of these needles perpendicular or side by side. And remember, the outside of our work, or the public side, is facing out on both sides because we want this seam to show. I'm going to get the working end of my yarn ready. And what I'm going to do is just knit these stitches. I'm going to pretend that I'm working off one needle. Even though I've got the two here, I'm going to treat them as if it's one needle and that the 2 stitches that I'm working with are 1 stitch. So I'm going to place my needle as if to knit in the front stitch, and I'm going to place it in the corresponding back stitch. Now that's why as well, when you are doing the 3 needle bind off, the pieces that you're seaming together have to have the exact same number of stitches on it for this to work. So I have 30 stitches on the front piece and I have 30 stitches on the back piece of the shoulder. And I'm just going to knit them both together. So just knit them together. Now it's going to be a little bit loose, so I'm just tightening up those stitches with the tails that I have. But we can fix that later. I'm not too worried about that. I can tidy up those stitches later. Okay, so we've got 1 stitch on the needle. We're going to do the same thing with the second stitch of the front needle and the second stitch of the back needle. Do the same thing, just knit them together. Knit the 2 together, slide them off. And now we're going to bind off. We're going to bind off the this stitch here. So I'm sure that you're familiar with how to bind off stitches, but if not, I have a video on that. I'm just adjusting it a bit with the tail. So the first few stitches are going to be kind of loose, but you can just tidy those up by pulling on the tails. So again, we're doing the same thing, and I just use the back needle. You'll find what works for you, but I just use the back needle to pull the stitch over the second stitch to bind it off. And just continue along like that. We're going to put our needle through both of the stitches on either needle, knit them together, pull them off the needle, and then pull the first stitch on the right needle over the second stitch to bind it off. And so you can see we are getting that nice decorative bound off edge right there. So I'm just going to continue and just watch. It'll make sense as I do it. Again, if you know how to bind off, this is nothing new. We're just binding off 2 stitches, or we're just knitting 2 stitches first together before we bind them off. Slip the back stitch, just slip it onto the front needle and then knit the 2 together and then bind off. Either way works. It's just whatever you find easier. Okay, so let me just show you how it looks so far. Now look how nice that looks. I think that's a really beautiful look to a seam. It's like, it almost looks like piping when you're sewing a garment. I remember that's a detail that my mom, when she was sewing, she would often put piping along seams or on the edges, just this decorative little roll that really looked interesting. And I think this gives the same effect. Just gives another bit of texture and dimension to the piece. So I'm just going to bind off this last stitch here. I'm going to take the tail and just put it through the loop of the last stitch and tighten it. So there we have it. that shoulder is pieced together. So now I'm going to show you how to attach the sleeve.